And so I'm going to start with my Sitecore PowerShell Fundamentals class. And usually the audience I geared this towards is where people who are not all that familiar with using PowerShell with Sitecore, or people who may be experienced in PowerShell but haven't really used it with Sitecore before. So I'm hoping that even if I have people in the audience who have been doing this for quite a while, you might still get something from this. Um, I don't mind being informal, particularly since we're doing this remotely. So if you have questions, feel free to ask. If you want to leave them till the end, that's fine with me too. We'll play it by ear. If we get to a place where we're at a complete halt, I'll ask people to wait till the end. But I'm not anticipating that. Okay, there we go. So in terms of my agenda for today, I will introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. Um, I'll talk about what PowerShell is briefly, the module and tools that's available in Sitecore to work with PowerShell, PowerShell's nuances and strengths. How do I get started? Common PowerShell commands I use quite a bit. And then I have a couple of examples where I want to at least illustrate or talk about how I've used PowerShell to help me work with Sitecore items in particular. Unfortunately, I don't have these running on a Sitecore instance that I can show you that way. So I do plan to show you the code and discuss in detail what the code is doing and how I've used it. And hopefully that will give you ideas on how you could do the same if you haven't done this type of thing before. But PowerShell you could do so much more than what I'm going to illustrate. This is just to get your feet wet and get some ideas going. All right. Who am I? My name is Carlos Rodriguez. Who I work for is Arke Systems. They're mostly based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I myself live in Florida. I'm a remote employee, but my role is Sitecore Consultant or engineer, and I am transitioning to be a Senior Business Analyst for Arke. In terms of my Sitecore experience in general, I used to work for Sitecore. I was one of their trainer/technical architects for about 2.5 years. After that, I worked for a couple of Sitecore partners until I found a home at Arke Systems, where I've been working for the last 8 years, where as a Sitecore engineer, I've been primarily focused on development, system business analyst work. I've done some DevOps as well, a wide variety of things. I am a 6-time Sitecore MVP, where 3 times I got it for technology and 3 times I got it as an ambassador, including this year. Okay. To give you a little more information about Arke, if you guys don't know who we are, Arke is a technology consulting firm where we help develop websites, with the focus being to reimagine how we can use our customers' brands to connect with customers through more memorable, meaningful, and measurable experiences. We're actually just turning 20. Most of our employees are based out of Atlanta. But we do have satellites in Texas, Florida, Ohio, Belarus, Jordan, and of course Brazil, led by our own Rodrigo Pepelau. We have 80 plus employees. I think by now that number has risen to 95. But yeah, we're scattered all over the place. Okay. And if you have any questions about Arke, you can certainly ask me afterwards, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Okay. In terms of what PowerShell is, as we just deep dive into this, PowerShell is a cross-platform automation solution. With PowerShell, you can certainly issue command line commands, but it's also a scripting language, so you could put together a complete script and run that. And it serves as an automation platform. Okay. In terms of Sitecore PowerShell extensions, particularly if you worked with older versions of Sitecore, and I certainly have, Sitecore PowerShell's extensions was something we had to install as a separate module in order to leverage PowerShell on Sitecore. But I believe, and I think Rodrigo made this point clear, I believe in current versions of Sitecore, it just comes pre-installed because there's such integration between PowerShell and Sitecore. But once it's installed, you have access to a tool such as the Sitecore PowerShell ISC, where you can actually issue PowerShell commands, either through a command line process, or you can write a script and run an entire script full of commands you want to run through PowerShell. Excuse me. My biggest reason for using PowerShell as Sitecore is when I want to when I want to make changes to a bunch of items in a batch mode. because anyone who's worked with Sitecore items directly as content in Sitecore knows that it can be really tedious to change a whole bunch of items at the same time, because natively in Sitecore you can't do that in a batch method without doing some programming. So, and if you ever had to change something tedious on an item one at a time, if you have to do 100 items, you know how painful that can be and how long it can take. As you enter an item, make your changes, save it, then move on to the next item. So PowerShell is great for making batch changes to items, and that's predominantly what I use it for. But where PowerShell is concerned and Sitecore is concerned, it could be used for so much more. I remember between the Sitecore Instance Manager and using Docker for Sitecore instances, PowerShell was used to help set up a Sitecore instance. That's how powerful PowerShell is. And you had to be really comfortable with PowerShell to use it, though. That was the only drawback. But otherwise, if you didn't have trouble troubleshooting against a PowerShell script, there was a time where that's exactly how we would build it. And I'm sure you probably could still do it today if you're creating Docker images from scratch, and you're using that PowerShell mechanism to set up those Docker images before you create. Before you use Docker to set up your Sitecore instance. And so there's just so much you could do with it once you get the hang of it. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, I like using Sitecore's PowerShell ISC on the instance I'm using because it provides not only a place for you to run PowerShell in a command line fashion, but you can also load your PowerShell script in here. You could save it to Sitecore, so you can open it and run it anytime you want. Through save, you could save it into a Sitecore item, so you don't have to worry about storing this somewhere else. And I certainly do a lot of debugging of my script through PowerShell ISC. So note that you can run a PowerShell script, but you could certainly also debug through it. You could set up breakpoints right by the numbers for each line in your PowerShell script. Then as you debug it, you can step through it and make sure that your PowerShell script is working the way that you want. And you do want to take your time with this because PowerShell is really powerful. It's not hard to break something with PowerShell and Sitecore. So when I get to this point where I'm testing it out and debugging it, I take my time, set up breakpoints, go through certain parts of it line by line to make sure that what I end up with in the end works and won't break the Sitecore instance I'm using this on. Okay. If you point to a variable in your PowerShell script while you're debugging, it will let you know what value is being stored within it, so you know if it's doing the right thing as you step through your code. Okay. The lower half is an output window. So particularly if you're issuing commands to spit out verbal written output, I'll call it that way, you could see it in this blue area, which takes up the second half of your screen. And that could be another way of determining if your PowerShell script is indeed working. Okay. Particularly if you've done coding in a lot of other languages, PowerShell definitely has its own idiosyncrasies. Which is just another way of saying, there are certain things that work for PowerShell that wouldn't work anywhere else. And so I want to make sure I made a quick list of what I noticed about PowerShell, which tends to make it stand out from other languages I've coded in. For starters, your variables do not have to be strong typed. So you can immediately assign a value to a variable, and you don't have to indicate what type of data it needs to store. Symbols are not used for comparisons in PowerShell. So in other words, you wouldn't use greater than symbols, less than symbols, equal signs for comparison purposes. You would actually use text. So this -NE is not equal, -GT would be greater than, -LT would be less than, etc. if you need to make those type of comparisons doing things like if statements and things of that nature. The syntax is unique and can be tricky, so you do want to pay attention as you put together your code of how you put it together. Objects are a bit more nebulous, so you really need to know the output of a command to understand what's being fed to that variable that you may be assigning it to, and keep careful track of that. Piping is used quite a bit in PowerShell so that the results of one command can be passed into the next. For instance, using this getChildren command, I'm grabbing all the ancestors of a certain parent, the dash recurse, make sure I get all the ancestors, not just the immediate children. And I'm piping that into a for each object loop so that each child or ancestor, I said ancestor, but it's descendants, each child of those descendants can be evaluated individually through the for loop. And I do that quite a bit when I write script against Sitecore items using PowerShell. All the variables start with a $, which to me is pretty unique for a coding language. And again, Sitecore items are well supported by PowerShell to the point where even Sitecore provides documentation of how to use PowerShell with Sitecore if you're going to use PowerShell scripts to manage those items, among other things. So why do I like using PowerShell? In terms of my development background, where I've done a lot of .NET backend coding, it's certainly a lot less coding for the same buck than I would have to do if I was writing in .NET, whether it's C# or .NET Core or what have you. It's less restrictive than .NET. There's a lot more flexibility there. I don't need Visual Studio or any other heavy development tool when I code in PowerShell. I often use Notepad. So I write my PowerShell script in that, and usually I transport it to ISC when I'm ready to start debugging with it and make sure it works the way I want to make it work. I haven't tried it with VS Code yet, though, to see if it would do any degree of debugging for me so that I can do it in a safe environment rather than do it in ISC where I always run the risk of updating a Sitecore item in a way I didn't intend to. Certainly one of the things I like the most about it is that I don't have to worry about compiling it. Once you put your script into Sitecore, it will just run. You don't have to worry about DLL management where that's concerned. It's very powerful. It's certainly faster, particularly if I'm doing a batch job, than manually manipulating a large number of Sitecore items. Anyone's ever had to do that will definitely know what I'm talking about. The code can be stored and reused in Sitecore. That's no problem. And you should be able to assign it to something on Sitecore's ribbon or many of its other interfaces, so that if you want a content editor to leverage the script, that's certainly possible, which is a good thing because your typical content editor is not going to be coding in PowerShell, and chances are their level of access won't even allow them to do this. You have to have a really high level of access in Sitecore to code in PowerShell. In the times that I've done it, I usually have admin access to that Sitecore instance, so for me it's not a problem at all. But you need a pretty high level of access to Sitecore to be able to code in PowerShell. So your typical content editor is not going to have that. So if I'm creating the PowerShell script for that person, then I'm looking to assign it to some part of the Sitecore interface so they can leverage the code to run it on whatever item they're running it on. And the coding language is well documented. I certainly have used Google more than my fair share of times to figure out how to do something in PowerShell. There's a Sitecore Slack channel completely dedicated to PowerShell scripting, so you can ask your questions there if you're using Sitecore Slack. And you could also use the Sitecore Stack Exchange to ask questions relating to what your use of PowerShell. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this part is just go over some common Sitecore PowerShell commands that I use quite a bit to manipulate items using PowerShell. This is not an all exhaustive list at all, but these are probably the ones that you'll use quite a bit, and that's why I want to reference these particular items. Okay, so you guys are sort of quiet, so are there any questions so far? You guys are all good? You can give me the thumbs up or whatever works for you.
Nothing in the chat so far.
Okay, great. Cool. So I'll go ahead and get started with some of my examples. Get children I use a lot because often when I'm asked to write something in PowerShell, it's over a set of items. And usually the easiest way for me to grab those items is starting with their parent. So I'll point to the parent, and usually it's the master database because I would want to audit my changes before and then publish them out. But then I would use the get child item to grab all of its descendants. And in order to grab all its descendants, I would have to include the dot recurse because otherwise, if I leave it out, it should only grab the immediate children. Okay? And then I do a for each loop, for each object loop in this case, to perform that processing on each descendant it found. And to reference that item within the for each object loop, I use the $_. So that's how each item is directly referenced. there's a get item command, because sometimes, particularly if I have the GUID of the item, I want to just directly grab it in Sitecore and then manipulate it moving forward. So in this example, I'm actually strong typing this particular variable to a multi-list field object. And this is just the reference to it, so I can grab it by that particular name. And then I use get item to directly grab the item that represents that field in the item in which it exists. Okay. What's sort of funny is that if I wanted to rename an item in using PowerShell, I would actually use the move item command. So not only can I use it to move an item from its old location to its new location, I would also use it to do a rename. Another way for me to recursively go through a set of items or a set of children or descendants is by just setting up the location ahead of time. And then if I could do a get child item now, it's in reference to the location I set it to. So I set this one to home, and when I do a get child item and I include the dot recurse, I'm grabbing all the descendants underneath the home item. So that should be a very large list. And then I'm just doing a for each loop on that list. And note that I'm piping the results of the get child item to the for each loop. Okay. Find item. So sometimes in Sitecore I need to find an item, and the only way to do it is to perform a search. So when that's the case, the find item command down at the bottom is what I would use to perform that activity. Now, in terms of what do I feed it as my search parameters, it starts with this props object where I'm telling it which index to use. I set the criteria with the criteria array that's up above. And then in terms of the results I want to get, in this example, I'm ordering the list of items that might come back by the updated date. Should be the last updated. I always have trouble saying in terms of dates. So the first one item in the list should be the last time it was updated, and then the previous time before that, so on and so forth. I just want the last item in that list. Last meaning the last item to be updated. Okay. Hopefully I'm saying that right. But note that for my criteria, I set the name of the item, the name being the name of that's the name of the field within the item, but it's also the name of the item to whatever I'm going to name it. I'm setting the template name, and I'm setting the path where I would find it, so it's not searching the entire content tree. Okay. Now, anyone who's written code to edit the content of an item directly knows that you have to use a begin edit to set the item for editing, and then an end edit when you're done. And in PowerShell, you do the same thing where you have an editing begin edit function and an editing end edit to indicate when you're going to begin editing the item, make your changes, and then end edit the item to save those changes. Okay. What I want to talk about now are some additional PowerShell commands that I actually use quite a bit, and I'm very fond of. And my first one is the show list view command. I use this one quite a bit. I'm a fan of it. What happens when you use the show list view command is that it generates a modal containing the information you pass to it. And usually the way this starts is that you create a new object. I tend to call it a record, where you include the information you want to capture in that array for that object. And then what you want to end up with is an output, which is an array of each one of these records. So once I collect a whole array of records, I then pipe that into my show list view command, where for each value item I defined in each record, I set up a column name, which is indicated by the label, and then the expression is to expose the value of that named item in each of the arrays. Okay. Once it runs successfully, I get a modal like the one on the right, and it's in the modal for each column. Whatever I call the column in terms of the label, that's what you see here. And then what I see below is the values provided by each of the record objects represented in the output array. And I could certainly analyze the results of this, but certainly one of my fondest things to do with this is to export it. So note that I can export it into a CSV file, Excel, HTML, JSON, or XML. I can certainly search through the list if I'm looking for a particular row. I can certainly navigate through the list using these buttons on the right. And in the lower left, you'll see how many records are returned, and that translates into how many pages. So it's not unusual for me to generate this modal, because what I actually want to do in the end is export it into a certain file format, which I could then analyze in whatever application is going to absorb it next. Okay. Right host. This is how I echo whatever is going on in the script to that lower below field I pointed out earlier. And particularly when I'm in the debugging stage, I put a lot of these in there so that I can tell, based on where the right host is located, if my script is performing or not, because it's going to echo out the value of these variables or text that I'm pushing out. So I use it quite a bit to get a sense of whether what I'm getting from my script is actually correct based on what I'm asking the variable to do. Okay. All right. Import CSV. I actually did have a situation where I asked somebody, well, what items do you want to impact? And they gave me an entire list telling me what the old value they wanted was in that field they wanted to change and what they wanted the new value to be. Well, again, because I know PowerShell, I had no intentions of updating these items one at a time. But because they passed me an Excel file, I converted that to a CSV file and then used the import CSV command to import the file and then run through each row within the results set. So what typically happens is that when this command is hit, it will launch this modal asking me to upload the file. And then I do. So if I compare it to this CSV file, which I'm going to bring onto the screen, hopefully you guys can see it. This is an example of what I imported. So whatever you make label that first row as the name of the column, that actually becomes the attribute associated with the row. And then as you look at each row in the results set, that's how you navigate down each row and grab these values and then have your code work on it. Okay. And so even if I don't use this all that often, it's a nice little thing to keep in your toolbox for PowerShell script in the event that someone passes you a file listing what they want you to change, rather than just telling you where in the content tree they want you to change the items in question. Okay. All right. So those are the common commands I like using as it relates to PowerShell. And now we're at the point where I'm going to demonstrate or discuss a couple of examples. And I'll apologize beforehand that I don't have a Sitecore site to use to demonstrate these, because these I demonstrated on the client's Sitecore instance. But I feel like I can still effectively talk about these examples and show you the code and discuss how I use this code to do the things that I was planning on doing. So for my first example, I'm producing a location list where, let's say in my Sitecore instance, I'm maintaining a list of location sites, and now I'm at the point where I want to export that somewhere where I can do an audit of those sites, perhaps look at some additional information associated with these locations, and determine if I need to update those items on Sitecore directly. Excuse me. So what I'm going to do is just go to my Sitecore site, pull out the location name, city, and state, pass that to a CSV file so that particularly if it's being processed by a different system, the CSV file is already created. But I can also pull it into another application like Excel and do a direct audit if that makes the most sense. So let me pull up that code and I'll show it to you. Okay, and you guys should be able to see the code, but please let me know if you can't. It's currently in a Notepad++ file that I have open. Okay. I'm not hearing any complaints, so I'm going to assume you guys can see this code.
We can see it.
Okay, cool. All right. So typically what I do is I create variables that point to the field names that I'm going to leverage, and then I'm ready to look at those items in the content tree that contains the items I want to evaluate. And here's an example where I start at a certain location. Let's say I have a location, a location in my content tree called locations that contains all the location items that are being used. And because I want to make sure I grab them all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the .recurse parameter so it gives me all the descendants under this item, not just the top level children. I'm going to pipe that into a for each object loop where for each object, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to start by creating an empty array, and then for each item, there's a .fields array where within that, when you place the name of the field, like location name as an example, it retrieves the information about that field in an object, and then you can manipulate that any which way you want. So for the object in question, I grab these three fields. Then what I have a tendency of doing, if I'm grabbing all the descendants, is I examine the item template. Because particularly if each of these locations actually represent a page, then each of these location items may have an assets folder and may have data sources underneath that assets folder. And I want to make sure that my code ignores those because they don't have any of the fields I'm actually looking for. So with that being the case, first I look to make sure that the item in question has an item template. And then I have a tendency of matching it to the display name. So I have a display name called, let's say, US location page. And if the item in question, its template, has that display name, I then continue moving forward. Otherwise, if it's the assets folder or one of its data sources, this if statement should ensure that I skip over those items. Okay, so right now I'm creating a record to pass it into a show list view command. So for the record, excuse me, what I'm passing in is the location name from the location name field by grabbing its value attribute, which is the data stored in that field. And it's the data that you would see in the database, the SQL database, if you were looking at the field value there. In other words, the raw value in the way that I'm using it. Okay. There are other ways to use it where if I know the type of field, I can strong type it and then reference that field based on how Sitecore evaluates the information within a strong type field. But in this situation, since I'm dealing with text fields, I'm perfectly fine with grabbing the raw value using the value attribute, which pretty much just means the text you typed into the field. So I'm grabbing that for the location name, city, and state based on the direct field reference that I established by grabbing that field from the fields array of each item. And then I'm just keeping a count, and I'll explain why this count is important shortly. All right, to keep track of what it's doing, I'm using the write host command to write to the output interface that I have in the PowerShell ISE tool to let me know how many records it's examined and give me just the location name. So I know that you've made it through that particular location item. And then once I've created the record successfully, I then add that record to the output array. I initialize the output array at the very top, and now I'm adding a record each time I go through each valid item. Now, right now it's commented out using the less than, greater than symbol and hashtag, but note that when I initially run this, I tested with 50 locations. And I'm doing that because I want to make sure this code is running correctly. So as I'm debugging it, I'll step through certain lines to make sure that, what I'm getting from my record looks exactly right. I'll probably look at the output to make sure I'm successfully collecting the records. But and on top of that, I'm going to set a limit on how many records I want it to collect because I want to make sure I'm getting the right output. So I'm going to test it with 50 locations. And if I get the show list view modal with those 50 records, then I feel confident, particularly as I audit those records, that I'm getting the right information. And if after the audit, I'm getting the location name, the city and the state and everything else I'm looking for, then I'm ready to comment this out and allow the for loop to complete itself, and then do the show list view step at the very end. Note that I do a write host to let me know that the show list view command is about to start. So I take the output array, pipe it into the show list view command. The column names will be location name, city, and state. And then for each record in the output, I want to pull out the location name, city, and state as my expression. So it's no coincidence that the name matches the exact names I gave it for each record. Okay. And then once it's done, I do a write host to let me know through the output window that it's done with it. Okay. So go to the next slide. I should get something like this, where I get a modal where for each record I see a location name, a city, and a state. And if the intent is to export this out so that the next step in the process can evaluate it, I can click on the CSV link up here. It will generate the file with a CSV extension, and then I could pass it along. Otherwise, if I was going to visually analyze it in Excel, I could certainly export it to Excel and do the audit that way. The one thing I would mention is that particularly if you're going through a large number of records, do expect it to take it a couple of moments for the modal to show itself. When I did it with 50, it shouldn't take very long. But once I do it on the entire location list, note that mine has about 3,000 records, then it may take a while to come back with 3,000 records. It's one of the reasons why I like having a count step in my PowerShell script and have my PowerShell script spit out the count step, because then it could at least give me an idea of how many records it's done evaluating before it gets to the end while I'm waiting. So it's not a bad idea to have some type of status mechanism that's being pushed to the screen so that you're aware of how many records it's going through before it gets to the end while you're waiting. Okay. All right. So that was not too difficult a first example. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Okay. And this is one that I actually did have to do one time before, where the idea here is that as part of a site, they have a customer support portal, and as part of their portal, they provide a list of questions and answers to go with them. And every once in a while, they want to be able to audit these questions and answers to make sure that they're relevant, up to date, and accurate. But they don't want to do this in Sitecore, because going through each item in Sitecore for the purpose of this audit could be a little bit tedious. So rather than have to go through a content tree and go through each item one at a time, they want us to create a PowerShell script that would provide them the list of questions and answers. This would be particularly true if for some reason this customer portal, this customer and answer section of the portal is maintained in a bucket, because then you really got to drill down to get to those items. So they want me to create a PowerShell script that will collect all the questions and answers without requiring someone to go through each item individually, and put that into an Excel file, which can be shipped to the marketing team, who will then do the actual audit. Okay, so I'll show you what that looks like and how that could be different from the first example. Okay, so in this example, I'm going to provide the name of the question and answer field. I'm just going to initialize a category name and subcategory name variable. Here's my record initiation for that array, my output one, and I'm going to keep count. Okay, much like the last example, I'm starting where the customer support section of the site is. I'm going to do a dash recurse so that I go through every ancestor so that I make sure I don't miss any item. That might, there might be, for all I know, there might be questions underneath questions as children items. Okay, so as I go through each record, I create a direct reference in the fields array to the question and answer, and I retrieve the template because I only want to deal with those items that are specifically designed to store the question and answer. Note that in this example, I actually checked the content of the question field because if it's null or empty, that's an item I don't want to evaluate, even if it is a valid item, because chances are if it doesn't have a question, it doesn't have an answer either. Or even if it did have an answer, that'd probably be the only reason I would include it in the list. But hopefully no one is creating too many items where they provided the answer to the question but left the question blank. Okay. But in the event that someone created an item, they just didn't complete it with a question and answer, I probably want to skip those. I'm still checking the item template. I'm going to use the display name and the name of the item in terms of its display name is question detail page. Now, this is organized in a way where the category of a question and answer is the grandparent, while the subcategory is the parent. That's the organization of those items. And so notice that if I want to retrieve the parent of an item in the content tree, there's a parent attribute associated with the item object. And if I want to grab the grandparent, all I got to do is use parent twice. And it does the same thing. But since I'm only interested in the name, I just grab the name attribute of that item. Note that the parent attribute references an item object, and so would the grandparent one. All I want is the name so that when I provide the list, they know what category it applies to and what subcategory it applies to. Okay, so now I'm ready to create my record object. And in doing that, I pass in the category name, the subcategory name, the question, and the answer of the item. Okay. Actually, I'm passing a direct reference to that field item, question and answer, which I'm allowed to do, and it will still give me back the question and answer in that text field. Okay. I'm using the right host to provide me a count of questions that I'm looking at, and I'm even asking it to give me the answer so I know which question and answer object I'm looking at. Okay. And again, I'm keeping count. 1, to keep track of how many items I'm evaluating as the script keeps running. And 2, I want to keep track of the count because, like before, I actually test a subset of the question and answers to make sure I'm getting the right stuff. So each record is being collected into the output array as before. And when I initially tested it, I stopped at five of these. So I look at the modal to see, am I capturing the category successfully? Am I capturing the subcategory successfully? Am I seeing the question correctly? Am I seeing the answer correctly? So on and so forth. Note, by the way, that there's also a break command here so that once it provides me my modal, it ends the code. Okay. But once I'm satisfied it's working, I comment it out. And after the for each loop evaluates every question and answer, I then use the show list view to provide the modal. Okay. And again, I'm going to provide the category, subcategory, question, and answer. So I should have a picture of the modal in my next slide. Here it is. So note that, okay, here's the category, subcategory, question and answer, which I can now pass to the marketing team for them to audit, and they're much happier about getting this list than having to go through Sitecore and go through each item individually. Sometimes what I might have done for this actual example, which I didn't illustrate here, is that I might have passed them to GUID as well, so that if they didn't like a particular question and answer, they could search in Sitecore by the GUID of that item and track it down that way if searching by text is a little too much. Okay, but that's what I did. So all I had to do afterwards was export it to Excel and send it to the marketing team by email. And they were very happy with it. All right. So any questions before I move on to the last example? So far, so good?
So far, so good.
All right. Let's move on to the next one. All right. Now, this example is a bit unique from the others I've illustrated, so I'm going to definitely spend more time talking about this one. In this one, we had a situation where we're going to replace an old story structure set up in Sitecore with a brand new one. And they didn't want to reuse the old stories. They wanted to, so at some point they stopped adding stories to the old structure, and anytime they had new stories, they added it to the new structure in a separate place in the content tree. The problem was, though, in terms of the old structure, was that it was known that people would bookmark the old structure. And we didn't want people to just hit a 404 once the old structure went away and the new structure took its place. So what they wanted to do, or what they wanted us to do, was to set up a create redirect mechanism. Now, what that meant on the back end was that they would update the pipeline where the URL resolving to an item was concerned to intercept the request, see if a redirect is associated with the item in question. I say item, I'm going to be more accurate and say URL in question. And if the URL is flagged for redirectment, it will then update the request to go to the new URL request versus staying with the old one. And that's what we wanted to do in the event that someone looked for the old story. We would redirect them to a new story or redirect them somewhere else if that made more sense. Okay, so with that being the case, what happened was uh, they didn't want to create all the redirects from scratch because it was literally hundreds. So they asked me to create a PowerShell script to create all the redirects because what they were doing was going through the trouble of creating an Excel file that in one column I had a list of the old story names, and in the second column, this is where we wanted to go if they request the old story name. And that's what I needed to do. So for this example, I'm assuming that I'm going to absorb a CSV file. For each entry in the CSV file, I'm going to check to see if the redirect already exists, because if it does, I don't want to create it again. So in other words, I was anticipating that I might need to run this script more than once in the event that I either have an incomplete list of redirects to create, or if I had some reason to stop the process in the middle, and then I got to rerun it again to recorrect the redirects. And if I kept a couple, I want those to be skipped. Okay. I also check to make sure that the story they're looking for exists, because if they deleted the story, meaning that the story no longer has such little relevance that they thought it made more sense just to get rid of it. And if they did, I'm not going to worry about a story that no longer exists on our system. So I decided to add that as part of the code. But once I was done, for each old story that needs to be redirected somewhere else, I create a redirect entry. And once I'm done, then I have a whole list of redirect entries. I'm not performing any publishing of my items through code. You can do that in PowerShell. There's certainly a lot of commands associated with publishing items. I have a tendency of not using it because I like to audit the items I create to make sure they look correct. And only after they look correct will I manually publish them out. Because, if I would be tempted to create publishing commands in PowerShell if I was creating items in random locations using PowerShell, and then I want to publish them right away because otherwise I got to track them down and publish them individually, which would be no fun. But since I'm talking about a set of redirects that will all exist under the same parent, it's very easy for me to run a manual publishing process starting from that parent and publish the sub items, and then I'll be done. So that this way I have a chance to audit what was created and feel comfortable that what I created is actually what needs to be there before I publish anything out. So this one is definitely going to be a little more complicated than the last one I created. So let me pull up the code and let's talk about what I did here. And this was actually for me a lot of fun. All right. I create a bunch of global variables. I will reference them as I use them, so it makes more sense of what context, why I created these. But the first one will be the file path. And this file path is actually referencing the Sitecore temp folder that Sitecore provides, so that excuse me, I'm sorry, I got distracted because someone just reached out to me. So this temp folder should be referencing the one that Sitecore provides. Well, part of it is what Sitecore provides. What I mean by that is that under settings, under this configuration settings from Sitecore, it's going to point me to the data folder that Sitecore provides for every instance. Under that, we created a temp upload folder, or Sitecore provides it. I can't remember which, but either way, I'm sending my file path to that, so that I'm placing it somewhere, which should be a fine place for the uploaded file to live while I'm using it, and then I'll get rid of it once it's done. Note that I'm setting the overwrite option so that if a file by the same name already exists, just overwrite it. Don't worry about it otherwise. Okay. This first check is, if for some reason the file path doesn't make any sense, just exit the code. Okay. So now my next step is the import command. So the import command is going to launch that modal that I showed you earlier. I'm going to select the file. That file will be sent to the file path. And then I actually do a row count, because I want to make sure my result set actually has rows for me to work my way through. If the rows count is less or equal to 0, there's no file for me to evaluate. Let's get out of the code by exiting. Otherwise, I'm ready to move on. This folder item, which is using a GUID to find the item, is actually my redirect folder location. So in one of our global folders, we have a redirect folder location, which houses all my redirects, and it's used throughout the entire site. I believe for this example, I created a subfolder, because when the redirects are evaluated, it looks at all the redirects, all the ancestors underneath a particular folder. So I wanted to create a particular subfolder specific to the story situation, so that I only have to go into one particular subfolder to look at the ones that get created that need to be audited. So this GUID points to that subfolder that I created beforehand, and that's how it's identified in code. Okay, I actually write that folder name out to my output screen so that I could visually identify the folder I wrote it to. Okay, so now at this point, I'm going to use the result set from my Excel file, or CSV file, I should say. Let's see what I'm going to do for each row. Okay. Sorry, let me check one thing very quickly. All right, I'm just responding to someone very quickly so they're not waiting another hour before I tell them what they need to know. Okay, all right, so for each, I have the CSV file right here. And if we compare it to these three steps, note that the column heading, which is my first row, is URL, category, and recommend URL. Probably not the best names for these columns, but that's what I went with at the time. What's in the URL column is the name of the story I want to redirect from. It's actually the name of that item. Category, I was tracking this to see if there's anything here I could use it for. In the end, I didn't use it, so actually, technically, we could ignore it. But for the recommend URL, it's meant to be a URL that it's going to redirect to. So for this example, and for some degree simplification of this example, I'm just going to treat where it's going as an external URL link. If I wrote a more sophisticated version of this, I would treat it. I would have GUIDs or external URLs. In the event I would use a GUID if it was staying on the inside. I would use an external URL if it's leaving the site when it hits this story item. Because in some cases, we did have to redirect them to a resource that's outside the site I was on. But for this example, they're all going to be URLs. All right. So, and I'm keeping count of the number of records. Okay. So my first question is, do we already have a redirect for this story? So I set the database to master, which is where I'm going to do all this evaluating. The folder item is where the redirect folder is. And I'm naming the redirect by the name of the story that I'm redirecting with, or from, I should say. So I expect it to be this name. Okay. So it's going to check whether the redirect exists by doing this test path. And if it exists, I actually spit that out to the output. I am going to use it later, whether I determine to create a redirect or not. The next thing I do is that I look for the story to see if it even still exists on my site. Because if it doesn't, I don't want to bother with a redirect, because no one should be looking for it at all if it doesn't exist. Okay, so what's going on here is I'm setting up my criteria, where the name of the item, and that's what the item name, the name of the item within an item. Boy, don't say that 5 times fast. The name of the field is underscore name in Sitecore. That's where it stores the name of the item in question. So that's what I want to look at. And I'm comparing that to the name of the story from the CSV file. I'm going to make sure that the template name is a story template. And the full path where it's going to start looking is the Sitecore Content Home Stories item. So in other words, that's where I want the focus of the search to be, not the entire content tree. Okay, so to complete the properties of my search, I wanted to use the master index. I wanted to use the criteria I just defined. If it finds more than one item, give me the last one that was updated. Okay, but I'm expecting it only to find one item. All right, so now I perform the find item command and find the item using the properties I passed to it. And then I pipe it where if it finds it, it should give me these properties. And actually in this case, because I'm using the select object, it'll split them out into the output. So I'll see the item ID, the name, the path, and the last time it was updated. If it doesn't find the item, then it'll actually let me know it couldn't find the item. So I want to see that in my audit trail on my output window. Okay. All right. So in PowerShell, you can certainly do a try-catch phrase. And under item exists, I'm checking to see if it's false, because if it has a redirect, I want to stop here. I also am going to check if the story exists, because if it doesn't exist, I also want to stop here. So if the story does exist and the redirect does not, then I want it to continue. What I wanted to do next is, first of all, the path of my new redirect is going to be where the redirect subfolder lives. That was folder item that was up here above. Okay. Then I'm going to create my new redirect item. This item type followed by this GUID. This GUID is the template of the redirect item. The name will be the name of the story I'm redirecting from. Okay. Now that I've created the item, and I called it $item, not very inventive, but that's what it's called, I'm now ready to edit the item. So I put the item into edit mode by doing a begin edit. Now what this is all about, rather than discuss it from the code, I want to go to a certain slide. Not this slide, this is where I upload the file. I want to go to this slide, because what's going on here is the following. When we go to a story in our site, it's the site domain followed by stories, followed by a story category, followed by the name of the story. That's how you get to each story on our site. But when the item is found, what you will find on our Sitecore instance, that underneath the category of the story, we bucket all those stories. We have it in a bucket structure. We don't pass that bucket structure to our story URL. So part of how our site works is that when you provide us the URL of your story, we actually search for the story. under its category through the bucket system. And once the story is found, that what gets pushed to the browser. Okay? So because that's the case, when we set the path over here on this redirect item, that's what this image is, the URL needs to reflect the URL of the story minus the bucket structure. So all these 4 lines of code is about is to help me find the story category and then set up the story structure starting from the story's path. That's what I want to stay. Because what the path is meant to represent is the URL to that story minus the domain that would be at the front. Because the first thing is because we already know what the domain is. That's in one of our config files. Okay? But we don't want to use Sitecore Content Home because that's not part of the URL because that gets replaced by the site domain's URL structure. Okay, so all this is to help me isolate the story category so that when I set up the new path for my path field, it starts with stories, right? Instead of the Sitecore Content Home. It provides me the category and the name of the story to redirect from without providing me the bucket structure. Okay. Notice, by the way, that the target field is a link field. And what I'm going to pass into the target field is the URL it's redirecting to. And then the disallow multi-site is a checkbox, which tells it that if I'm redirecting within a certain microsite, don't jump to another microsite. Okay? Stay within the microsite you're on. And then this is my enable checkbox so that if I want to disable a redirect but not delete it, I could just remove this checkbox and publish it out. Okay, so if I go back to my code, here we are. Okay, I now have my new path and I set that to my path field within the new redirect item, which is what it's doing over here. Then what I do to set up my target field, which is a linked field, is that I strong type it, my variable to it, which is link field, and have it point to the target field, which is a linked field. And then this allows me to manipulate the field using attributes which are specific to the link field type or link field class. So note that in PowerShell under Sitecore data fields, there's a bunch of field classes which allows me to strong type a variable that serves as a pointer to a field that has that field type. So note that for the link type, I set it to external, which is no different than me clicking on the inserted external link. I pass in the URL I am redirecting to into the field. And then, because there are checkboxes, I set the disallowed multi-site field to 1 which means checking it off, and do the same thing with the enabled field. Okay. The last thing I do is that this redirect goes through a workflow. So I want to make sure that at the end, its workflow state is approved, which would be the final workflow step. So how do I do that? Well, in the variables at the top, I find the name of the workflow state field, which is __ workflow space state. And then what I pass to it, since it's a reference field type, is the GUID of the approved workflow state as defined in Sitecore. And this is pretty global. So once I pass it that particular GUID, that's the same as setting the workflow state to approved. So now the item is approved when it's done being created. So that means I can publish it right away. And then I do the end edit to save all my changes. I write out to the host, to the output screen, that I successfully created my redirect item. So I know that it's ready to go. And if at any time, for any one of these, it failed to create it, in my catch block, I want to know which one that is so that I could create it later. Now, if it's like 2 or 3, I will most likely create it manually. But if it's a whole bunch of them, that will tell me that I need to do some debugging of my code and figure out why they're failing in such large numbers. Now, for something as important as this, you can imagine that I tested with a very small subset to make sure that the whole thing works before I do it for every single story in that CSV file. Because if I remember correctly, we did this for about 150 stories. So with that being the case, I want to test it with just 5 at first to make sure that it actually works. Okay. Once I satisfied it worked and I got my 5 redirects, I was happy. And I was then ready to run it on the entire set. And that's what I do. It's currently commented out, but once I'm done, I would then remove the file that I uploaded in the beginning, so it's no longer in that temp upload folder. Then I'm done. Okay. Are there any questions about this example? Here's a question. From the differences of PowerShell versus other languages, what part you think makes a positive difference and what is just obnoxious? If I understand your question correctly, to me, what's obnoxious about PowerShell is that because it's so flexible, it really requires you to understand the syntax and how things work. So flexibility is great, but it's also a curse in the sense that if a programming language is flexible in terms of syntax, it really means you need to know what you're doing. Because if you write the syntax wrong, you could break something. But did that answer your question, the person who asked?
Yeah, and I think that question came from because you have a slide about the differences, the things that you see different in
Yep.
PowerShell compared to other languages.
Yep.
Um, but I think you answered that. Yes, thanks.
Okay. But I think that based on my experience with PowerShell, there are so much more pros than cons. So for me, if it means I need to put more time and be careful in my testing of it to make sure that my syntax doesn't break anything, I think it's well worth it when I think about the amount of time it saved me in updating items one at a time. Okay. So for those of you really new to PowerShell, how do I get started? Make sure PowerShell extensions is installed. If it is, because otherwise, if it's not, you're not going to get very far. Make sure you have the correct permissions on your Sitecore instance to work with PowerShell from scratch. Admin works every time, but for some reason they don't want to give you admin. Make sure, I'm not sure if admin's the only but I'm willing to bet that there are specific PowerShell permissions that you can give to somebody that will allow you to work with PowerShell even if you're not an admin. But the admin, will definitely have to hook you up with that in order to do that. Of course, once you're set up with it, you can certainly launch it. Make sure, by the way, that your access level is high enough to see the tool. Because let's just say that for content editors, they never see this tool. And then code carefully, because PowerShell is very powerful and can create damages to your instance if you don't test carefully. What I have a tendency of doing, if it's within the possibility, particularly if it's the first time I'm running the code, I'll package the items I'm manipulating as a backup so that if I break those items, I can reinstall the package and get those items back. Try to avoid creating endless loops in your code, because if you do that with a PowerShell script, someone with admin privileges on that box will have to do an ISS reset to stop it. I think it's even a good idea that if you know what the upper limit of items are in terms of what you're changing, build into your code a hard stop once the number of items that are evaluated hits a certain number. And this way you avoid the endless loop scenario each and every time. If you wind up finding out that you didn't cover all the items you need to change, then just increase the size of the hard stop. Okay. Use write host a lot to echo the status of your codes so that you know what it's doing. Use breakpoints often, and the debug option to step through your code, particularly before you run it, to make sure that it's doing the things that you expect it to do. And I always run a short test on a limited number of items so I can audit the results and make sure it's doing it the way I expect it to do it before I run the code against all of it, all the items that you're after. Okay. So, in summary, PowerShell is a powerful tool, well integrated into Sitecore. Sitecore and PowerShell really like each other. Great tool for manipulating multiple items in a batch job. One suggestion I certainly have is maintain your own library of code. One of the reasons I write blogs about PowerShell is that it also tends to serve as my library. So that if I need to use PowerShell code again, I know I don't have to go any farther than my blogs to look for it, but I certainly maintain my own in my own folder structures on my own PCs. There is tons of help out there if you're new to PowerShell. Sitecore has its own documentation for PowerShell. If you want to learn more about how to use PowerShell with Sitecore items, there are tons of experts on this too. Mark West comes to mind right away. Um, there's a dedicated Sitecore Slack channel to PowerShell. You can use the Sitecore Stack Exchange. There's tons of support for using PowerShell and Sitecore, so you should never run out of places to go if you have questions. Okay, so I'm wrapping up. Again, my name is Carlos Rodriguez. My Sitecore Slack channel, if you're on Sitecore Slack, is Sitecore Sabor. My personal email is Filter413, which is the one I tend to tie in with Sitecore, but my corporate one is crodriguez at ark.com. My Twitter handle is Filter413. I don't use it that much, so you're better off sending me an email. But I do have a LinkedIn bio. And also, I have a blog site where a lot of it I talk about the PowerShell scripts that I write. So you can certainly go there if you're interested in more examples of how I use PowerShell. So any questions? Hopefully I didn't take too long. I sort of lost track. I wasn't sure if I went over an hour, but I'm at the end.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Carlos. Great session. Lots of important links as well. Anyone, please use the chat if you have any final thoughts, or even I can elevate you and you can speak. Just raise your hand and I can give you the power to speak.
And if you're interested in the presentation and the examples, I'll provide them. I have no problems with that. I'll create a PDF.